So I just sent out a tweet about the slides, so if you want that, it's on Twitter. You can click on it instead of trying to type it out. So I'm going to jump right in, do a quick poll here. So how many people are familiar with what Composer actually is? And of you that still have your hands up, how many of you actually use it? Okay. So I'm going to run through a little bit real quick about what it actually is and what you might want to use it for. Essentially, it's just a command line dependency management tool for PHP. And what it does is it basically manages your project dependencies. So you can have different versions of things for any given project. And essentially, it maintains the state of your application. So why would you want to use Composer? So for starters, it eliminates duplication. So what Composer does is instead of having you copy code from one project to the next, and then realizing after you look back 6 months down the road, you've copied it 10 times and altered every single one of those to a different state, what Composer does, it gives you a canonical source that you can link up to any project that you're in. And so when you update it, you can update it across all your projects and make sure you have the same code. So by providing that canonical source, it allows you to easily manage your code. It also provides you with consistent versioning. This is important not just for you and the work that you're doing right now, but it's important for your entire team to make sure that they're actually using the same versions of code. Because if your team gets out of sync, you're going to be fixing things that really don't even need to be fixed. So making sure your team's on the same page is very important. And then reusable code. So essentially what Composer kind of forces you to do is think a little bit more modular. And by encouraging this modular development, it allows you to simply declare your dependency and reuse your code much easier than you would probably normally. So Composer has some kind of high-level features I want to hit on real quick. So one of them is automatic package installation. So it'll actually go and find all the packages that it needs to and install them into your project. And it does that very well. It also provides bulk package updates. Of course, you can update individual items as well. It provides class and file autoloading. So it'll automatically load the files that are needed. And depending on how it's set up, only when they're needed. It also allows for recursive dependencies. So if you have something that you release and you know that it depends on something else, you can set that up, and then anybody who uses your thing, they automatically get the dependencies that come along with that. And then for package discovery, Composer has some built-in features that allow you to discover new packages in case you ever need to find new functionality. So installing Composer is really easy, and just so you know, this tool is one of the tools that has, I would say, the lowest learning curve to other tools like maybe Grunt or Gulp and things like that. This is very simple, and I'd encourage you to actually install it now and start playing around with it. Installing it's very simple. There's basically 2 lines of code if you're on a Mac. If you're not, there's an installer. Very simple to do. So once you get it installed, you can run a command from the terminal, Composer diagnose, and it will basically check your system and make sure that you have everything set up that you need to be able to use Composer, such as making sure it gets installed, you have internet access, that kind of thing. So let's talk a little bit about how you actually use Composer. So Composer has some commands. I'm going to kind of walk you through what those are and what those would mean on a typical Composer-based project. So the first command is Composer init. So if you have a new project and you want to actually use Composer, Composer init will create something called a composer.json file, which is nothing more than a configuration file that declares what your dependencies are and what the versions are that they should be in, and provides some other metadata information about your project. So Composer validate, if you for some reason needed to go in and actually manually edit this configuration. Sometimes if you don't get the JavaScript object notation syntax correct, your thing won't run. So Composer validate will actually check your configuration and tell you if you've have any issues in it, and it can be very helpful if you do any manual editing. So the first thing that you do once you have a Composer JSON file is you would run composer require and then the name of a package that you want to install. So some third-party library. And what that'll do is it'll add the necessary requirement line to your configuration, and we'll actually go ahead and install that, download and install that thing package for you. There's also a flag for dev, so if you have something that is not a production dependency, but it's a dev dependency, so for example, you have unit tests you want to run on dev, but obviously you don't want to put all that extra code up on production, you can use the dev flag to get control over that. And then composer install is the command that once you have your configuration set up and you're sharing your repository, your team's going to download the repo, they're going to run composer install, and it's going to go fetch all those dependencies and set them up for your team, and they'll be ready to start development. And this has actually cut down a lot of the ramp-up time for new projects. A lot of times you'll spend time getting people's systems set up and making sure they have all the right things installed, and this cuts that down significantly. So by default, composer install does all of the dev dependencies, so if you ever do it on production, you want to make sure you use the no dev flag. So very simple, just want to make sure you're actually aware of that. And so then there's also composer update. So composer install basically fetches predefined versions. Composer update actually checks for the new allowed versions that your configuration says that you can install. And that will do it across the board for anything that you've added to your configuration. You can also update a single package. So if you have a specific thing you want to update, you can run composer update, name of the package, and it will do that. So on this update, just know that when you run an update, it's restricted by the version or version range that you define in your configuration. So when you do a composer remove package, it basically does the exact opposite. It removes the line from your configuration saying that that's a dependency, and it will then uninstall automatically from the system that package. And then finally on the package discovery, there's a command composer search package, and that'll actually allow you to discover new packages, or if you're looking for information on a specific one, it can point you in the right direction. So the way that Composer works, it has kind of a built-in repository where it stores all its packages, and it's this online packages.org URL. So you can actually go there and browse via the web what's there, what's available, and for me, if you go there and you do a search for WP Scholar, it'll pull up things that I've registered on packages. It's real easy if you wanted to release something to add it there. So if you've got something that other people would find useful, then I would recommend you give that a shot. So obviously you have to register things if you want to use them with Composer via Packagist, but you can also register your own custom repository in your configuration. And this is actually supposed to be one line, but I had to make it big. You can check the online slides for this if you want to. You can actually manually edit the config if you want, but this is a command that will add your GitHub repo as a custom repository. And the only requirement when you do this is that so you would add this as your repository. You would do require package, and your package would need a name, which means that you would need to run composer init on the repository that you registered, so that it actually has a composer file that can be read, so that composer knows how to use what you've created. So when you're configuring things, it's important obviously to specify versions. So Composer has a few different ways that you can do that. The first is obviously to specify an exact version, such as 1.0.2. You can also define a range of versions, so anything greater than or equal to version 1, but less than 2.0, as an example. And wildcard version So this, in this case, would be essentially any bug fix that comes through. It would automatically allow you to update and get that, but not go beyond that at all. And finally, there's also this tilde 1.2 type syntax, which basically says update all the way up until the next significant release. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but this is assuming that the project that you're using as a dependency is using semantic versioning. And you can also use version stability flags. So you can specify the version and then at stable, or you can just specify at stable and get whatever the most recent stable version is. So those are some handy tags that you can use if you want. Obviously, like for example, if you're creating a custom thing and you want to make sure you always load the dev version, you can specify that and know that you get the latest dev version when you do composer update. So semantic versioning, if you're not familiar with it, you can go to semver.org and find out more about it. But I'm going to introduce you to it if you're not familiar in about 3 slides. In general, the basic rules are simple. You have a major version number, which is the first number in your 3-digit sequence there. And anytime you make a breaking change of any kind, you update that number and you clear out the remaining numbers to 0. So you'd be, 2.0.0 or 3.0.0, whatever that may be. And the minor version is that middle number. And essentially, anytime that you add new features that don't break backwards compatibility, then you would update that middle number. And then finally, your patch version is anytime you make bug fixes, not really new features, just a fix that is backwards compatible. So regardless, if you do anything that breaks backwards compatibility, semantic versioning says you must increment that first number so that everybody knows to expect, something probably will break. So I'm going to go a little bit into kind of how Composer works to give you a little bit more background. So this composer.json file that I've been talking about is your configuration. And as you can see, it's got basic meta information, name, description, license, the authors, and then it has a require statement that says, this is the package and this is the version numbers that we want to allow to be used with our setup. And what happens is when you run Composer update or Composer install for the first time, it actually takes that and creates a Composer lock file. And what this does is it basically says, these are the current available versions that are allowed via the configuration, and we're going to lock those in so that the next time somebody on the team runs Composer install, they're going to get these exact same versions. So regardless of the fact that, new code's been released 10 times today, we locked it in at this version, and this is what our team's working with to get through launch. And so we're not gonna change it. So you typically have a gatekeeper that would be the one who would run Composer update to make sure things get updated reasonably. And then this composer.lock just ensures that your team's on the same page with the versions of everything. And then what happens when Composer takes all these things and installs them is it creates a vendor directory, which is in that same place as the Composer file that you create. And it pulls all these dependencies in and throws them into this one directory. So obviously, if we're talking about WordPress, that's not ideal, but we'll get there. So this is just a basic Composer intro at this point. So it adds all these things into a vendor directory. And then all you need to do is in that vendor directory, it creates an autoload file for you. And you can just require this one file, and it will load up all of your libraries at once and allow you to immediately start coding against those libraries. So then the question of the hour is, how does this work with WordPress? So there's a couple different use cases when you're using Composer with WordPress. The first one is you have a custom plugin or theme that you're trying to develop. And maybe you're using it internally, maybe you're releasing it publicly. But essentially, if you're doing this, you're going to be including libraries that aren't really plugins or anything like that. You'll just probably use an independent PHP library, and you'll need to include that in your theme so you can use it. So typically, in this case, all you would do is use Composer as you normally would. but then you would just make sure you have your autoload require statement somewhere in your theme or plugin, and then make sure that you actually commit your vendor directory if you're releasing this thing publicly. So the other use case is if you actually have a custom site or application that you're building, and you want to manage everything. So this is great when you actually have a professionally managed site. So for example, you are in complete control of all the plugins that are installed on this site, and the client really has no say, right? So big enterprise clients, that kind of thing. Or if you simply just want to refuse to allow your client to install things, you can use it in this case as well. But for the common, small business client site, you can still use it, but typically my recommendation is that you use it up until you hand off the site to the client, because obviously they're potentially going to install things, and then you're obviously not tracking that at that point in Composer. But I think it's a great way of doing it is using it up until you hand it off to the client, because then when they go and destroy their site and come back to you pleading you to fix it, it's really just clone the repo, Composer install, everything's back to the original version. Now, if we want to update things, we can go and do those one at a time and figure out, what any potential issues are as we go from there. So it gives you an easy restore point if a client ever comes back. So this is how you will go about setting up using Composer with WordPress for a site or application. So in this case, what we're doing is we're just going to require WordPress as a dependency. And John P. Block from 10up has created this, which is a composerized version of WordPress. So it's essentially a mirror of WordPress with a composer.json file added, because we said that's a requirement. So that's all that is, and it allows you to use WordPress with Composer. So then we were talking about having custom repositories and being able to register those things. So the next thing that you want to do is make sure that for any publicly available theme or plugin that's in the WordPress.org repository, you can actually register this wpackagist.org repository into your configuration. And what that'll do is basically what this service has done. So if you go to wpackagist.org, it will actually give you a list of all the plugins and themes that are in the WordPress repository. And essentially all it's done is it's added the composer.json file for you. So just the fact that it's been committed to WordPress.org, you can now use it with Composer. So this is very handy. And then finally, you want to install something called Composer Installers. And so what this does is it basically allows you to make sure that WordPress themes and plugins, because WordPress obviously has a particular directory structure that it wants to be able to find these things in a particular place. And so what this is going to allow you to do is actually put those where they need to go instead of being everything dumped into that vendor directory. So then, in your configuration, this is where you actually have to do a little bit of manual editing. You can define your WordPress install directory if you'd like. If you don't, it's going to be WordPress. But the installer path is where the custom installers plugin or Composer dependency comes in, and it basically allows you to set the path for each type of thing. And there are three types. There's a WordPress plugin, WordPress theme, and WordPress MU or must use plugin. So if you are creating a new theme and you want to use it with Composer, you'll do your Composer init and just define the type as being a WordPress theme or plugin, depending on what you're creating. So this is typically the file structure that we end up with when we use Composer with WordPress. So WordPress actually ends up being its own separate directory because it's its standalone repository. And then the content directory is where all of the other repositories, dependencies, plugins, themes, that kind of thing get put in. And obviously you can see there's a vendor directory, which is where any other things might live that aren't really themes or plugins. So if you still need those, they would go there. So you can go through all those steps, or You can use Composer for project bootstrapping, which is what I like to do. And you can do something like Composer create project and then the name of a package. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to take a repository that's known, typically on packages.org or locally registered in your system, and it will basically clone that repository or project skeleton, if you will, into the location that you specify, and then we'll run Composer install on that to get all the dependencies that that particular skeleton or setup or a project that you've created, so that you have everything in one place. So I've created a kind of a basic WordPress skeleton for Composer, and what this does is it allows you to run Composer create project WP Scholar, which is my handle, and then / WP-skeleton. And running that command after you've installed Composer will clone this repo down and essentially go ahead and do the Composer install, which will pull down the latest version of WordPress. And at that point, you can then run your Composer require whatever plugins or packages that you want to install, and they'll automatically end up where they need to go, and you can then start development on that new project. So for those of you that use something like VVV, I have one that's called VVV skeleton. So if you take VVV and you run this command within the www directory, and you can get, there's a parameter that comes at the end after the VVV skeleton. You could do a space and then the name of the directory that you want that thing to create. So you can actually use this to create new projects within VVV. And there's a README in there. I won't try to explain it all at this point, but basically you can run through a couple steps to set up your custom domain and make sure your database is unique, and then do your provisioning, and all of a sudden you now have local dev ready to go, which is actually really handy when you've got a team of people, because VVV comes with Xdebug and the profiler and all those great things. So it's a really good way to kind of get, if you don't have a process at this point, to really bring your team together and get something going. So as far as that's concerned, I am done. But I'll be happy to take any questions in the back afterward. So thank you.